Welcome to Twilight Fables, where the shadows of fairy tales stretch long into the night, and the stories you thought you knew come with teeth. Tonight, we begin a new tale, one of locked doors, crimson keys, and a groom whose love leaves no room for escape. This is Bluebeard, the key that bled. The sky was the colour of old bruises the day he came into town. The market square, usually loud with the cries of hawkers and the shrieking laughter of children, fell into a hushed rhythm the moment the stranger's carriage rolled over the cobblestones. It was a monstrous thing, high and gleaming, carved from wood so black it drank the sunlight. Horses with manes like tar and eyes like spilled ink snorted steam as they stomped, their hooves ringing like bells from somewhere deep underground. Isabel watched from the upper window of the tailor shop. Her needle paused mid-stitch. Her younger sister clutched her arm with a gasp, eyes wide and foolish with fascination. "He's here," the girl whispered. "That's him. That has to be him." Isabel said nothing. She was watching the man. He stepped from the carriage like something painted, his coat a rich, saturated indigo, the fabric moving like wet silk. His beard was trimmed and darker than night, the hair on his head black as pitch, but it was the blue of him that caught the light strangely, that made her pulse slip sideways. Even from a distance, he didn't look quite right. He was too still, too smooth, too deliberate. His eyes scanned the crowd, and though he wore a pleasant enough expression, Isabel felt as though he were counting them, measuring them, weighing them. Someone in the square whispered a name, Bluebeard. Her family spoke of him at dinner, their voices tinged with excitement. Her mother adjusted the sleeves of her only silk dress and speculated about his holdings. Her father, usually so dour, actually smiled as he chewed his roast duck. They say he has lands out by the sea. Old money, real money. "Didn't he marry once?" her brother asked. "Or twice?" "3 times I heard," said her aunt, lowering her voice, each one younger and prettier than the last. "They say the last wife vanished." "Died," her father corrected, more sternly than usual. "A fever, I think. That's what the letter said. The town doctor confirmed it." "And the 2 before that?" Isabel asked. The room quieted. "They were delicate," her mother said gently, setting her wineglass down. "Unsuited for country life." Isabel stood from the table. "So he buried them in indigo silk and came looking for another." She met him 2 nights later at a ball arranged by the magistrate. Isabel had been forced into a borrowed gown, rose-coloured taffeta that made her look like a wilted peony, and stood awkwardly by the punch table until her name was called. She turned, and there he was. He stood head and shoulders taller than anyone else, and his eyes glowed faintly beneath the golden chandelier. When he bowed, it was with such gravity and intention that it felt like falling. "Isabel Thorne," he said, his voice like warm wine. "They didn't tell me the town's jewel was so sharp." She felt a flush rise in her chest, but didn't smile. "They say you're a collector of wives." he didn't flinch. Only when they are worthy of being preserved. His words slithered somewhere between a compliment and a threat. They danced, and though she'd never been graceful, she moved as if her bones had forgotten their usual stiffness. Something about him softened her movements and bent her instincts. He didn't smile with his teeth, but he watched her like she was the only thing that mattered in the room. And Isabel felt it. Not love, not even desire, but compulsion. Like a door swinging open with no key. The courtship lasted exactly 2 weeks. Bluebeard, he never offered a first name, sent her music boxes and mirror compacts, perfumes from distant islands, a necklace made of freshwater pearls that felt cold even when warmed by her skin. He walked with her every evening, always in a different cloak, always dressed like dusk. Her family encouraged it. Her mother beamed with every new token. "He's enchanted," she said, and Isabel silently agreed, only she feared it was the other kind of enchantment, the sort old crones whispered about when children wandered into the woods. Still, she accepted, because her family needed it, because there was a strange gravity in his presence, because something in her wanted to see what was behind the stillness of his eyes. They married quietly, under a storm-heavy sky. The estate was further than she expected, half a day's journey through woods that grew too tightly together. Their trunks gnarled like reaching fingers. The carriage moved through thick fog, as if pulled by ropes, and by the time they reached the gates, Isabel could feel a change in the air. The wind no longer blew right. The silence was too deep. The house, if it could be called that, was enormous, Gothic, crumbling in places, with towers that reached into the sky like spines. Vines wrapped the lower floors, thick and coiling, as if trying to strangle the stone. The main door was carved with symbols she didn't recognize. Circles within circles. Teeth inside mouths. No one greeted them. The house opened with a groan and swallowed her whole. She met no staff, no servants. Bluebeard simply said, "They're discreet," and led her through the halls. Every corridor looked slightly different, some with velvet wallpaper peeling at the edges, others with dark wood panels that reflected her face too clearly. The air was thick with the smell of rosewater and dust. Rooms lay beyond rooms, music chambers, libraries, a gallery filled with portraits of women, all beautiful, all unfamiliar, all with a strange sadness behind the eyes. "Your sisters?" she asked quietly. Bluebeard gave her a tight smile, in a manner of speaking. He handed her a heavy iron key ring. Dozens of keys clinked together, each different in design and material. Silver, brass, glass, bone. "This is yours," he said. "The house is yours. Go where you like. Play, explore, open any door you wish." She examined the keys. Near the centre, one stood out, a small, dark key, no larger than her thumb. It was blackened, with a red jewel set into the handle. The jewel throbbed like a pulse. "Any door?" she asked. His eyes sharpened. "Except one." He pointed toward the eastern wing, a long hallway, darker than the others, where the wallpaper looked like peeling flesh. "That one is mine alone. Do not open it, Isabel. No matter what you hear." She nodded, but even as she did, she felt the key grow warmer in her hand. That night, she could not sleep. The bedroom was too quiet, the bed too large. The moon poured through the windows like cold milk, painting the ceiling in pale shifting shapes. She lay there, staring upward, until she heard it. A sound, faint, far away, like a woman weeping. She rose barefoot and padded down the hallway. The keys jingled softly at her hip. The eastern wing loomed before her, doors stretching down either side like waiting mouths. From behind the last door, she heard it again. A sob, soft, then something else. A wet, dragging sound. Her hand moved without thinking. The key was already between her fingers, already bleeding. She gasped and dropped it. It clinked against the stone. There was blood on her palm, fresh, but the skin was unbroken. The key was crying. She turned and fled, heart pounding, not daring to look behind her. The next morning, Bluebeard was gone. A note in his neat, slanted hand rested on the breakfast table. "Business, 3 days, the house is yours." Underneath it, the black key sat alone, clean, dry, and waiting. The house did not breathe. It pulsed. Isabel felt it the moment she crossed the threshold of the eastern wing again. Though the air was still and no wind stirred the curtains, the temperature dropped, not a gradual coolness, but a sudden, sharp plunge that bit into her bones. The walls whispered, but not with sound. They whispered in the way shadows fall, in the way light seems to bend when you're being watched. And Isabel was being watched, not by eyes, not by servants, not even, as far as she could tell, by ghosts, at least not yet, but the house itself. The house had an intelligence. It didn't move, it waited. She spent the morning exploring, trying to ignore the persistent sensation of something behind her shoulder. The house was massive, a warren of passageways and endless doors. Many of the keys on her ring fit only one door. Some rooms were useless, empty parlours with dusty furniture, ballrooms with moth-eaten curtains. Others were strange. A room filled entirely with bird cages, all empty but one. The single cage held a mirror, small and cracked, with a frame shaped like curling vines. Another room had no floor, only a pit descending into darkness, with wooden beams stretched across like ribs. The key that opened that door was silver, but it hissed in her hand when she touched it again. She left it there, locked it twice. In the afternoon, she discovered a library. It was quiet and sweet-smelling, like old paper and cedar wood. The books were in several languages, some with symbols she couldn't name. One book had a leather cover that felt oddly soft, too soft. She didn't open that one. Another had no text inside, only ink drawings of women, sometimes standing, sometimes dismembered. She stayed in that room longer than she meant to, feeling something like calm settle over her. Books were safe. Books didn't bleed. It wasn't until she turned to leave that she noticed the portraits on the walls. At first, they seemed normal. Generations of nobles, faces bored and pale, but one of them drew her eye. It was a woman, painted in profile, wearing a deep blue gown. Her face was beautiful, but blurred, as if the painter had forgotten how to finish her features, and Isabel could swear the figure was wearing her necklace, the freshwater pearls Bluebeard had gifted her. She turned back to the painting. It had changed. Now the woman faced forward. Her eyes were hollow, and there was a trail of blood leaking from the corner of her mouth. That night, the dreams returned. They were different from before, vivid, sickening. In one, she was walking through the forbidden hallway, the key bleeding steadily in her hand. The walls were wet, and the carpet squelched beneath her feet. She opened the door, not one door, all the doors, and inside each room was a version of herself. One screamed, one wept, one had no face at all. She awoke with the taste of rust on her tongue. The key was on her bedside table, though she swore she had left it in the drawing room. It was dry, cold, but her sheets were stained red at the hem. On the second day of Bluebeard's absence, Isabel found the music room. It was lined with instruments, all covered in sheets. A grand piano stood in the centre, untouched. She lifted the cloth and ran her fingers across the keys. They gave a dissonant hum, off tune, but not broken. A violin leaned against the far wall. When she picked it up, dust fell away like snow. She pulled the bow across the strings. A low, terrible wail rose from the instrument, too deep for its size. It vibrated through her chest, shaking something loose in her memory. The sound brought tears to her eyes without reason. She put the violin down and backed away. Later, as dusk crawled across the windows, she noticed something peculiar about the mirrors. There were too many of them. Some were hung on doors, some embedded in furniture, and some freestanding in the halls like sentries. Each reflected a slightly different version of her. One looked older, one younger, one bruised. And then she found the cracked mirror again, the one from the birdcage room. It had been moved. It now hung in the hallway outside her bedroom. Its surface flickered slightly, like candlelight behind water. When she looked into it that evening, she didn't see herself at all. She saw a woman with her face, but her hair was soaked. Her eyes rolled back. Her mouth opened slowly, and from it came a key. Isabel screamed and turned away. When she looked again, it was her reflection, but she couldn't be sure. By the third morning, she began to notice things had shifted. The hallways were subtly wrong. A turn that had led to the dining room now opened into a corridor she didn't recognise. The sun no longer rose through the right window. And the paintings were all watching her now. Not dramatically, not like a ghost story, but subtly, cleverly, a shift in the pupils, a slight tilt of the mouth, a suggestion that they knew her movements. One painting, a woman in a red veil, had her head turned toward Isabel each time she passed. It was painted in profile. It should not have been able to turn. By evening, she had memorized the layout of the main wings, or she thought she had, but when she returned to her room that night, the door was gone. She stood in the hallway, staring at the blank wall. She turned around, paced back the way she came. No door, no room, just hallway. She panicked, heart thundering, skin crawling. She ran blindly through the maze of corridors, calling out, shouting, trying to find anything familiar, and the house shifted again. At the end of one corridor was a mirror, her mirror. She stepped toward it, reaching out, and saw something move behind her reflection. She spun around, nothing, but when she looked again, the reflection behind her showed a woman, hair matted with blood, mouth sewn shut, standing just over her shoulder. She punched the mirror, glass shattered, cutting her hand. Blood smeared across the frame, but the reflection didn't break. The woman in the mirror stayed intact. She found her room an hour later. The door was where it had always been, as if nothing had changed. Inside, the key ring rested on her pillow. The black key was wet, and beside it, something new. A single white feather. That night, she did not sleep. She lay in bed, hand bandaged, staring at the ceiling. The chandelier above her had begun to sway, though there was no wind. The feather on her nightstand moved occasionally, as if stirred by an invisible breath. She heard footsteps outside her door, light ones, barefoot. She got up and opened it. The hallway was empty, but on the floor were wet footprints, leading back down the corridor toward the eastern wing. In the early hours, as dawn barely stained the sky, Isabel stood again before the forbidden door. The black key in her hand felt heavier now, like it had absorbed something from her blood. The red gem pulsed gently, syncing with her heartbeat. She turned it slowly, listening. From behind the door came a sound, not crying, not footsteps, not even breath. It was whispering, but not words. It was the sound of fingernails on a coffin lid, and the door smiled. The key had teeth, not just metaphorical ones, not merely jagged edges forged in metal. As Isabel stood before the forbidden door, hand trembling around the small blackened object, she felt the unmistakable impression of tiny incisors, as though the key itself had a mouth, and it was smiling against her palm. The gem set into the handle throbbed a steady red, not quite light, not quite colour. It was like pressing her hand against something warm and pulsing, like the skin over a vein. The door didn't look special. The wood was old, blackened like the rest of the house. with curling iron scrollwork, and a handle shaped like a serpent, biting its own tail. But it watched her, not with eyes, never that obvious, but with weight, with presence, with a quiet hunger that echoed in her bones. She knew she shouldn't. She knew what came next in every cautionary tale. But the key had called to her, night after night. It burned in her dreams. It bled without cause. It hummed when she passed this wing. And now, her hand moved without her consent. She inserted the key, and the door sighed. It opened with a sound like exhaling lungs, slow, deep, reluctant. Behind it was darkness, not the darkness of night, or even the darkness of basements. This was old darkness, heavy darkness. It draped itself over her like mourning cloth, stifling breath and thought. Even the corridor behind her seemed to pull back, the light retreating, as if unwilling to touch whatever lay beyond. Still, she stepped inside. Her feet sank into soft carpet. No, not carpet. Something spongier, something that gave slightly, like earth. The smell hit her next. Roses, rotting roses, sweet and wet and foul. She lifted a small candle, already lit, though she couldn't recall lighting it, and held it high. The room unfolded before her in slow, awful clarity. It was a chapel, or it had once been. Vaulted ceilings arched overhead, swallowed by shadows. Pews, half rotted, warped by damp, lined the room in uneven rows. Stained glass windows stood along one wall, but their images were wrong. Saints with stitched mouths, angels with no eyes, halos burning black. At the far end stood an altar, stone and slick, with something dark pulled on its surface. And around the altar, Isabel's breath caught. There were bodies, not fresh, but not skeletal, preserved, as though through alchemy or will. 7 of them, arranged in a semicircle, each draped in pale cloth, seated in high-backed chairs, like grotesque brides at some perverse banquet. Their mouths were sewn shut with red thread. Their hands rested on their laps. Each held something, a locket, a glove, a ribbon, a tooth, a scrap of lace, a severed braid, a key. And each face, each one, was frozen in a scream beneath the stitches. She stumbled backward, candle wavering. The flame danced, casting mad shadows on the walls. One of the women had her face. The room shifted. She wasn't sure how, but suddenly the ceiling seemed higher, the pews closer. The air pressed against her skin like a wet cloth, and the altar, no longer still, began to pulse. The dark fluid on its surface bubbled faintly. The key in her hand began to bleed again, faster now, in time with the rhythm of the altar. Drip, drip, drip. And then one of the women moved. It was subtle, a twitch of the finger, a flex of the jaw beneath red stitches, then another and another. The candle flickered wildly. Isabel tried to back away, but her legs refused to obey. Her skin crawled, Her eyes blurred. The women were waking up. The first one to rise was the one holding the tooth. She stood slowly, joints cracking, and turned toward Isabel with jerky, unnatural grace. Her face was covered in scars, fresh and old, and her stitched mouth tugged as though trying to scream. Behind her, another woman stood, this one with long silver hair and hollow eyes. Then another and another. They surrounded Isabel, forming a circle. The candle died in her hand, total dark, and in that blackness came the voices. Not words, not speech, just feeling. Each woman radiated something different. Grief, so heavy it bent the spine. Fury like fire beneath skin. Terror locked in a child's heartbeat. Resignation, a numb, dead cold. And worse, one emotion she couldn't place. An alien sense of longing that didn't belong to the dead. The key pulsed, and the woman who wore Isabel's face stepped forward. She lifted her hand. Isabel flinched. The woman pressed her finger to Isabel's brow, and suddenly she was falling. Memories not her own, voices, screams. She stood in a garden laughing, her arm looped through Bluebeard's. His smile was radiant, his eyes deep and kind. He offered her the keyring and kissed her hand. Her name was Eleanor. Then darkness, the forbidden room, terror. She screamed, the thread pulling her mouth shut as it tore through her cheeks. And again, another woman. Her name was Mirren. Another key, another promise, another death. It went on and on, each woman reliving her end, each woman burning, until Isabel thought she would go mad. She awoke lying on the cold floor outside the forbidden door. The candle was gone. The key lay beside her, clean, dry, as if none of it had happened, but her bandage had fallen off, and carved into the skin of her palm, in faint, neat script, were 3 words: "You are next." She vomited into the nearest vase. Then, dizzy and weeping, she staggered to her room. The paintings along the way watched her without blinking. The mirror in the hallway showed her reflection smiling, though her face was frozen in horror. When she reached her room, she found it already open. Bluebeard was waiting inside. He sat in a high-backed chair, reading a book bound in pale leather. He looked up and smiled, as if nothing were amiss. "My dear," he said, "you look unwell." She swallowed hard, every muscle screaming to run. I had a nightmare." He closed the book gently. "That happens sometimes. The house is old. It remembers things." He stood, crossed the room. His hand was warm against her cheek. "You didn't go in the room, did you?" Her voice caught in her throat. "No." He leaned close, inhaled the scent of her hair. "Good," he whispered, "because the last one who didn't come back quite right." His lips brushed her temple. "Sleep, Isabel. I'll be gone again tomorrow, but soon we'll begin the ceremony." She stared at him, numb. "What ceremony?" He didn't answer. He kissed her gently and left. She locked the door. She pushed the dresser in front of it. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands shaking, blood still fresh in her mouth. The key ring clinked softly in her pocket, and somewhere far below the house, in the dark, something stirred. The heavy silence that followed the door's closing settled like a shroud, but inside Leia's mind, a storm was raging. She sat on the cold stone floor of the chapel, hands pressed tight over her ears, trying to block the distant, echoing whispers. Voices, soft at first, like wind through dead leaves, then louder, more urgent. They were calling her name, not once, not twice, over and over. She pulled the candle closer, its flickering flame barely keeping back the darkness that clawed at the edges of the room. Suddenly, the stained glass windows glowed with a pale, sickly light. The images of angels with burned halos and saints with hollow eyes seemed to shift and move. From the flickering colours emerged faces, faces of women. They floated before her, translucent and trembling, the wives, their mouths stitched shut, their eyes wet with tears. They spoke, not with words, but with memory. Leia saw flashes, a hand clutching a blade, a tear tracing a cheek, a final, desperate plea swallowed by silence. One by one, the images grew clearer. She recognized the first woman, Genevieve, from the drawer, then the one who had held the tooth, another who had worn a crown of thorns. They remembered the nights they begged for mercy, the days they faded into shadows, the moments they were trapped in eternal silence, and they remembered her. Their gaze settled on Leia, not with accusation, but with plea. They wanted her to remember their names, to call them out loud, to break the curse of forgetting. The candle's flame flared, and with it, the chapel seemed to breathe. A sudden gust extinguished the light. Darkness engulfed her. When Leia's eyes adjusted, she was no longer alone. The women stood around her, solid, real, no longer ghosts. They wore their wedding dresses, faded and torn, but their eyes burned with fierce life. The woman who looked like Isabel stepped forward. Her mouth moved silently. Leia understood. Remember us? She reached out, touching the closest bride's hand. The moment their skin met, a jolt shot through her, painful and electric. Images flooded Leia's mind, laughter and tears, songs sung in cold rooms, promises made in blood, each story a thread in the tapestry of Bluebeard's horrors. She gasped, overwhelmed. The brides began to chant, a soft rising melody that echoed through the stone walls. Leia joined in, her voice trembling at first, then growing stronger. They sang their names, one by one, over and over, until the walls trembled, the chapel doors shook, dust falling from the rafters. The voices did not stop. The house wailed, and the key in Leia's pocket bled anew, this time crimson and fierce, like a beating heart. When the song ended, the bride smiled, not with malice, but with hope. They faded slowly, leaving Leia alone in the silent chapel. The key was warm in her hand. The door no longer whispered, but Leia knew the fight had only just begun. The whispering key no longer slept. In her dreams, Leia could hear it, soft as moth wings, persistent as guilt. It spoke in a language she didn't understand, full of syllables that gnawed at the edges of her thoughts. Sometimes it whimpered like a child lost in a wood. Other times it muttered prayers that curdled her blood. She'd hidden it beneath the floorboards, but even buried in shadows and dust, it pulsed like a wound beneath her skin. Worse still, the bleeding had not stopped. Each morning, Leia woke to find a fresh smear of blood beneath the wardrobe, trailing from where she'd concealed the key. Yet no matter how she cleaned it, the stain returned. It wasn't rust, it wasn't ink, it was alive, warm and red and wet. She was unravelling. The mansion had taken on new angles since she'd opened the forbidden door. Doors didn't lead where they should. Hallways were too long, too narrow. Leia once opened a linen closet and found herself face to face with a wall of bones, clean, white, perfectly stacked, before blinking and finding only towels. When she stared into mirrors, she saw herself frowning when she smiled, bleeding when she didn't. Her reflection's eyes stayed fixed on her even when she turned away. And Bluebeard, he had changed too. He had grown quieter, not cold, exactly, but gentler, like a man trying not to frighten a wounded dog. He brought her fresh fruit at breakfast, rare books at night. He asked her nothing about the key, but she felt his gaze linger a little too long on her hands. Leia wore gloves now, always. She needed answers, and not from the servants. They had grown evasive, polite to the point of eeriness. Only one remained, who seemed willing to meet her eye. Branwen, the laundress. The old woman's hands were warped by time and lie, but her eyes were as sharp as sewing needles. Leia found her scrubbing sheets in the scullery one morning, her bucket full of pink-tinted water. "She's bleeding again," Leia said. Branwen didn't look up. "It doesn't stop once it starts." "Who doesn't?" "The house," Branwen muttered. "The wives, the key, all one now." Leia crouched beside her. "What is the key?" Branwen finally turned her eyes to Leia. "The key is a tether. It binds what was hidden to what lives. You've made the wound real again." Leia shivered. "What's behind the door? Those women, why do they still suffer? Why were they left like that?" "They were not left," said Branwen. "They remained." "What do you mean?" "They were consumed, not just by him, but by the house. This place remembers what he does. Every scream, every slice, it echoes in the walls, and the house holds them, holds their names." Leia stared at her. "Their names?" Branwen's eyes glistened. He took them, girl, took their names so no one could remember them, so they could not call for help. He locked them in that room and unmade them. That is what the key guards, not just the door, but the memory of what he's done. Leia felt the words hit her like falling stones. Can I return them? The names. Branwen leaned in. There is a corridor beneath the chapel, a hallway of locked drawers. Each drawer has a name carved deep into the wood. Find the one that bleeds for you. Leia stood, her voice hoarse. Why would it bleed? Branwen smiled thinly. Because it wants to be remembered. That night, when Bluebeard retired early and the mansion fell into its moonlit hush, Leia stole down the winding servant stairs to the back of the chapel. It was a solemn place, hung with heavy purple drapes and long-forgotten icons. Behind the altar, she found a hidden panel, just as Branwen said, and beyond it, a narrow spiral stair that corkscrewed into the earth. The air grew cold, the walls grew damp. At the bottom was a corridor lined with drawers, hundreds. Each bore a brass plaque engraved with a name, some in Latin, others in dialects she could barely sound out. Some bore first names, some had only initials. A few were scratched out entirely, like shameful secrets. She passed them slowly, the key burned hotter in her pocket with each step, and then she saw it. A drawer, narrow and black, with no name at all, only a ragged gouge where the plaque had been torn away. A dark smear ran beneath it, like an open mouth, drooling blood. The key twitched, her breath quickened. She reached out, her gloved fingers trembling, and touched the wood. It was warm. The drawer resisted her, as if fighting not to be opened. She used both hands, teeth clenched, until with a shuddering creak it slid forward. Inside was a bundle of hair, long, dark, braided, tied at the end with blue ribbon, and beneath it a folded scrap of paper soaked through with dried blood. Leia opened it. One word was written in a sharp, slanted hand, Geneviève. The key screamed, not aloud, but in her head, in her blood, in every nerve ending, the sound of a name reborn. The air bent around her, the walls convulsed, the corridor moaned like a dying thing, and every drawer around her shook violently. She stumbled backward, clutching the key. The blood from the floor licked at her shoes, then her ankles, surging in a tide. She ran up the stairs, gasping, soaked in red. Behind her, the chapel door was slammed shut without a sound. When she returned to her chamber, she dropped the key onto the marble washstand. It hissed. Where it touched the surface, the stone cracked. The candle sputtered as the wick drowned in its own melted wax, casting long, quivering shadows across the tower's walls. The circular room, though small, seemed to pulse with its own breath, each beat echoing Marguerite's panic. She pressed herself against the wall, hand clenched tightly around the key, still warm, still damp. with its strange red stain. Her palm throbbed from holding it too long. She dared not look at it again. Below, the vast house had returned to silence. The footsteps were gone. No more knocking, no more voices. But that silence had teeth. It crouched, waiting to pounce. Marguerite's heart pounded against her ribs. She glanced toward the narrow slit of a window, just barely wide enough to let in the moaning wind. Somewhere beyond those hills, her brothers were coming. She had sent the letter 4 days ago, tucked into the hands of a merchant's apprentice who was delivering wine. But time was a frail thing in Bluebeard's house. It twisted around corners, crawled under locked doors, and forgot its own direction. A knock sounded, not on the door below, but behind her. Marguerite spun around. There was no door behind her, just the wall, just stone. Then again, knock, knock, knock. She stepped back, her shoulder brushing the window frame. The wall shivered. A fine dust sifted down from the ceiling. Hairline cracks spread across the stone, as though the tower were exhaling, shifting its joints. Something groaned beyond the stone, an almost human sound, but not quite. "No," she whispered. "Not here, not now." The key pulsed. It was glowing faintly now, a red ember in the dark. It had not cooled at all. The cracks widened. A spidering vein of blackness split the wall in two. Behind it, Marguerite could see, not more stone, but something breathing, wet and pale and moving with terrible slowness. The wall tore open like skin. She screamed, but the sound went nowhere. The house drank it down. From the wall stepped a figure, a woman, at first glance, tall, thin, with hair like willow branches, and a face that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her dress was soaked and clinging, patterned with red roses that wilted and dripped. Her feet made no sound as she stepped into the room. Marguerite backed away until her spine struck cold stone. The woman opened her mouth. A key dropped from her lips. It clattered on the floor, tiny and black, shaped like a thorn. Marguerite stared at it. The woman pointed to her own stomach. No, her skin split, peeling open like paper, revealing row upon row of locks, nailed into her ribs, her pelvis, her hips, every lock with a different shape, some ornate, some plain, some rusted shut, others slick with rot, and at the centre, a door carved into her chest, sealed with a crimson lock, shaped like a heart. Marguerite screamed again. This time, it made it out of her throat. The woman didn't move, didn't blink. Behind her, other shapes stepped from the wall. 5 of them. They were the wives. Their faces were different, their ages, their hair, but each wore a dress of rotten roses. Each bore the signs of what had been done to them. Mouths sewn shut, eyes scooped out, spines twisted so their heads lolled forever to the side. One dragged her leg behind her, another had no hands. One of them was the singer from the garden, her mouth nothing now but a gaping wound that sang a single broken note. They stood in a half circle, facing Marguerite. The first woman extended her hand. The key on the ground shook and slid toward Marguerite like a dog obeying its master. Marguerite picked it up. It felt cold, but real. "I don't understand," she whispered. The first woman turned and pointed at the slit of a window. The hills, the road. Marguerite's breath caught. "Are you showing me the way out?" But none of the women answered. Instead, they turned together and moved toward the wall. Not the wall that had opened, but the opposite side. One by one, they vanished into the stone, each swallowed by a different point, some through cracks, others through the floorboards. And the first woman, the one with the door in her chest, she stayed a moment longer. She placed her hand over her heart lock and whispered something that Marguerite could not hear. Then she was gone, and the room was silent again. The next morning, the key had changed. It was no longer red, but neither was it clean. It had darkened to a bruised purple, and its edges were sharp. It cut Marguerite's fingers if she held it too long, but she kept it close. Bluebeard had returned. He said nothing about the previous night. He kissed her hand, made breakfast, and read aloud from a book of fables that sounded more like confessions. He watched her too closely now, as if the eye beneath his beard had grown sharper. She pretended everything was fine. She smiled, she laughed, she touched his shoulder with affection, and she waited. On the fourth night after the visit from the women in the wall, Marguerite was summoned again to Bluebeard's study. This time, she did not wear the key around her neck. She had hidden it behind a loose board in the chapel wall, nestled among the flower crowns, left to rot by the others. Bluebeard's study was dark, no candles lit, only the fire in the hearth, burning blue. He sat in his armchair. His beard was braided tonight, his robe black and edged in silver thread. He looked regal, like a king or a funeral priest. "I have been dreaming," he said without preamble, "of locks that open backward, of keys that bleed, of brides who remember too much." Marguerite said nothing. He rose. "Come." She did. He led her down, not to the forbidden door, but to a lower corridor she had never seen, beneath the kitchens, beneath even the servants' quarters. It was a stairwell carved into the rock. They descended in silence. The steps grew narrower, the walls wetter, and then, at the very bottom, they stood before a door. This one was carved not of wood or iron, but bone, human femurs arranged in a perfect arch, skulls mounted like ornaments. The lock was shaped like a screaming mouth. "This is the final door," Bluebeard said. His voice was softer than she'd ever heard it, almost reverent. "I've never shown this to anyone, not even them." He gestured, and she saw shadows ripple along the walls, faces forming for a blink before vanishing. Marguerite stepped closer. "Why now?" "Because I think you might be ready." He removed a key from a chain around his wrist. It looked ordinary, but it smoked as he touched it to the lock. The door opened. Behind it was darkness. Not empty, not still, but alive. The black pulsed, moved, whispered, and from that dark, Marguerite heard something call her name. Not Bluebeard's voice, not the voice of the wives, her own, calling from the dark. And then the lock on her hidden key began to turn, though no hand touched it.
She stepped forward,
and the dark welcomed her. At first, the floor of the forbidden chamber held only silence. No wind crept through the jagged holes in the stone. No rodents scurried through the cracks. Even the air itself seemed dead, heavy and still. Claire stepped across the threshold, the key cold and sticky in her hand, her pulse thrashing behind her eyes. Each breath she took felt like it had to claw its way into her lungs. The walls were thick with shadow. The ceiling dripped with the condensation of old secrets. But what caught her eyes most were the mirrors, dozens, maybe hundreds, hanging like still faces along every surface of the room. Some hung straight, polished and cruelly clear. Others slumped on rusted hinges or cracked at the corners, their reflections smeared and weeping. They lined the walls, stretched across the floor, and even bulged grotesquely from the ceiling, each one watching. But they did not show her, not entirely. In each mirror, Claire could see herself, but different. 1,000 variations, 1,000 Claires, each trapped in an infinite cage of glass. Some were older, crone-like, with bloodied hands and hollow eyes. Others looked childlike and bruised, lips sewn shut or skin tattooed with intricate maps. One version of her, in a corner mirror near the floor, was hunched over a baby wrapped in thorns, rocking it violently with a smile too wide. Another Claire stood perfectly still behind the mirrored surface, her head turned the wrong way around. Claire spun, heart flaring, but the real room remained unchanged. Just mirrors, just shadows. She stepped forward, and the mirrors shimmered. A vibration passed through the floor, like a heartbeat, too deep to hear, but strong enough to feel in her bones. As she moved farther in, her steps disturbed puddles of thick liquid, black, viscous, and foul-smelling. One mirror dripped it like blood from a wound. Then she saw them. Not all the mirrors showed Claire. Some showed Bluebeard's other wives. Dead, yes, but moving, like puppets underwater. Their bodies floated in strange positions, skin grey, limbs twisted, eyes wide with terror. One reached for the glass with fingers that scratched from the inside, her mouth moving in silent screams. Claire stumbled backward, colliding with a mirror behind her, and it blinked. She stared at her reflection. It stared back and blinked again, out of sync with her. But Claire's mouth twitched. "You don't belong here," it mouthed. Claire turned away, but now all the mirrors had changed. None of them held her reflection anymore. They were filled with foreign versions, distorted wives, fractured memories, half souls. She was not alone. Something stirred behind her, a scraping sound, like bone across glass. Claire pivoted slowly. One mirror in the farthest wall began to bulge. Not just a reflection, something was trying to come through. The glass warped, flexed like a membrane. A grey hand pressed through, skinless fingers, slick and trembling, slithered out, then a shoulder, then the top of a skull, bald, eye sockets hollow and wet. It was her, but not her. This Claire had no eyes, only sockets filled with worms. Her jaw was unhinged, lolling like a broken doll's, and her neck was tattooed in looping red script. She opened the door. Claire stumbled back. The key burned in her hand again. She tried to throw it, but her fingers clung to it as if fused. A voice whispered from the mirrors, thousands of them, speaking in unison. You cannot leave without leaving part of yourself behind. She ran, but the room was no longer as it had been. The doorway had disappeared. The mirrors pulsed and shifted. Each step she took was mirrored by different Claires, some writhing, others still. One version bashed her own face into the glass until it cracked. Another danced, arms soaked in blood, humming a lullaby made of sobs. Finally she saw it, a small staircase, coiled like a ribcage in the far corner. It hadn't been there before. Claire sprinted toward it, dodging a mirror that crashed from the ceiling and shattered at her feet. Blood leaked from the shards, or maybe it was just more of the black liquid. As she climbed, the whispers grew louder. Leave the key, leave your name, leave your face, leave your soul. At the top of the stairs was a door, iron, twisted, alive with breath. It heaved in and out like a lung. She placed her hand against it. It sighed, then opened. Claire was through. She collapsed onto a velvet rug, coughing, the key still clutched to her chest. The room she entered was plush and silent, bathed in golden light, its walls lined with portraits. Everything was too perfect. It looked like a royal sitting room, immaculate and unused. Only when she glanced at the paintings did her stomach churn. Each one was of a woman. Each wore a wedding dress, and each one had her own face. Not just similar, her exact face. The portraits were lifelike, textured, almost three-dimensional. One of them even blinked. Claire turned to leave, but the door she'd come through was gone. Only blank wall remained. She heard the soft tap of footsteps. Familiar, Bluebeard's voice drifted into the room, calm and warm. I told you, my dear, you can go anywhere, but not there. Claire stood still, the key bleeding quietly in her hand. The manor pulsed, no longer a house, but a living labyrinth, breathing around Eleanor with each trembling step she took. The corridor behind her collapsed in on itself, brick and wood groaning as if in mourning, sealing her escape. Before her stretched the final hall, the door at the end aglow with a soft, sickly blue light. His sanctum, her chest heaved, her hand slick with blood, and something darker held the key, the one that had unlocked everything. It was no longer metal. It squirmed now, warm and veined, as though it were a sliver of Bluebeard's own flesh. It pulsed in rhythm with the house. Every beat reminded her she had taken too long. She had seen too much. Behind her came a voice, sweet, coiling like smoke through the cracks in the walls. "Darling," it whispered, "come to me. You've earned your place." She ran. The hallway bent beneath her, stretching and contorting like a throat. The carpet bubbling like hot flesh. Paintings lined the walls, new ones, of her, dozens, each one capturing her face in different stages of transformation. In some, she smiled like a bride. In others, she screamed, skin mottled blue, hair drifting in water. They were not painted, but grown, veins tracing her features in living pigment. At the end of the hall, the blue door throbbed. Eleanor raised the key and pressed it into the lock. It melted into the wood. The door opened on its own. The chamber beyond was cathedral-like, built of stone and bone. The ceiling arched into darkness, where thousands of keys hung suspended by strands of hair and sinew. The walls were lined with portraits, the original wives, not paintings, but them, preserved and posed in silence behind glass. Each one blinked, each one wept. Bluebeard stood in the centre of the chamber, naked but for a cloak of shadows that writhed with a mind of its own. His eyes were gone, replaced by twin embers. His beard, now longer, dragged across the floor, trailing behind him like a veil of ink. "You've done well," he said, his voice twofold now, his and hers, all of them. Eleanor took a step forward, her foot squelched in something warm. "You killed them," she said. Her voice didn't shake any more. It cut. "You drained them, took their blood for your paintings, their thoughts for your books, their bodies for your house." "I love them," he said, as if that were answer enough. He walked slowly to one of the glass cases. Inside was Beatrice, the first. Her hair still floated gently around her face, as if she were under water. She had no mouth, only wide, pleading eyes. "She gave me her voice, you know. I painted your name with it." He smiled. "I would have given you forever, Eleanor. You would have eaten me." Bluebeard chuckled. "No, I would have become you. You are the final brushstroke, the purest, the last." From the ceiling, the keys began to fall like rain, each one shrieking in a different voice. They clattered on the floor, dug into her skin, embedded themselves into her arms, her neck, her shoulders. Each one burned, Each one showed her a memory. Beatrice's laughter, Lucille's dance, Aline's lullaby, dozens of women, dozens of lives. He had kept them all, trapped in keys like cages, and now they were screaming. "Take your place," he said, arms open. "Be my bride," Eleanor screamed, but not in fear, in rage. She raised her arms. The keys writhed beneath her skin, and with a wrenching pull, she ripped them free. Blood sprayed across the chamber as she hurled them at the glass coffins. The cases shattered, one by one, each woman spilling out with gasps and sobs and screams. They clawed at the ground, at the walls. Some crawled, others rose, but all of them looked at Bluebeard and remembered. "No," he said softly. "No, no, no." They descended on him, dozens of wives, hundreds of hands. They tore at him, not just his flesh, but his essence, pulled free the parts of themselves that he had stolen, sucked the life from his beard, tore out the paintings in his skin. Each time a wife reclaimed a piece, he withered, until there was nothing left, just the cloak, which slithered away into the cracks of the stone, searching for another master. Eleanor awoke in the woods. The sky above was grey and unfamiliar. Her dress was in tatters, her body covered in healing wounds, her fingers still stained blue. Around her stood the others, the wives. Their faces were hollowed by grief and memory, but free. One by one, they turned and walked into the trees, except Beatrice. She stepped forward, eyes soft. "You gave us back our names." Eleanor opened her mouth, but no words came. "You still have yours," Beatrice whispered. "That makes you dangerous." She placed something in Eleanor's hand, a key, not one of the screaming things. This was different, small, iron, quiet. "Destroy it," Beatrice said, "or use it." She turned and vanished between the trees. Eleanor never went back to the manor. No road led there anymore, but she kept the key. Some nights she held it to the light, watching it shimmer, not with blue, but red, as if it still remembered, as if it still wanted to open something.
Some doors shouldn't be opened.
But some monsters never truly die, especially the ones you once loved.